but I think the Benjamin Franklin angle is just awesome, and especially tying in with the theme of the convention. Benjamin Franklin was a character and a man of great character. Dr. Mark Skousen, the title of his talk today is Benjamin Franklin, Conservative, Social Democrat, or Libertarian? Mark happens to be the 6th-generation grandson of Benjamin Franklin. He is also the producer of Freedom Fest, which is the Washington Post calls the greatest libertarian show on earth, and I highly recommend it. It starts in a couple of weeks in Las Vegas. I know it might be difficult for some of us to get there. There are flyers on the table. There is if you order your ticket online and put in the code LP, you get a discount. And I highly encourage you to try to attend that event coming up in a couple of weeks in Las Vegas. Like his famous ancestor, Dr. Skousen is a writer and publisher, having been the editor-in-chief of Forecasts and Strategies, an investment newsletter, since 1980. He is a professional economist and the author of over 25 books, including The Making of Modern Economics and the Maxims of Wall Street. He has taught economics and finance at Columbia Business School and is currently a presidential fellow at Chapman University in California. In 2006, on the 300th anniversary of Benjamin Franklin's birth, he compiled and edited, along with his wife, the completed autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, thus fulfilling Franklin's lifelong ambition that one of his descendants complete his autobiography. And Dr. Skousen has brought copies of that book, which he will sign and autograph at the end of his talk. I encourage you to purchase those. So, Mark.
Oh, yes.
Let's bring up Mark Skousen.
Benjamin Franklin said, "He that boasts of his ancestors does but advertise his own insignificance." So that put me in my place. But we do like to worship at the trough of the founders. The founders have a pretty good reputation over these years. And one of the things I found in writing and doing research about my illustrious ancestor Benjamin Franklin is that it's very difficult to categorize the person, to label them. We always want to label everybody, don't we? We're conservatives, we're libertarians, we're leftists, we're rightists, we're progressives. We all like to have a label, but you really have a hard time. I think the basic notion that I want to present today, my basic point, is that you can't buttonhole Ben Franklin in any particular category. And that's great, because I can speak to a group of hardcore Democrats who will love my speech on Benjamin Franklin. On the other hand, I can speak to a group of blue blood conservatives, Republicans, and they will love Benjamin Franklin. It'll be a tougher case to make the case that you will love Benjamin Franklin as libertarians. But I will make the best effort I can. So, and that will require me to counter the views of one of your favorite apostles, Murray Rothbard. So, Benjamin Franklin's a unique character among the founders. He was at the creation of the 3 most important documents of American government. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He helped write the Articles of Confederation, and of course, through his compromising efforts, we have the United States Constitution. Franklin was an advocate of a limited central government He was not a big fan of the executive or of a single president. However, he really liked the legislature and believed in democracy. Now, here's a statement that I think you all appreciate. And it's fitting very much with the theme of character that you have here. And here's what he said. And I found this in doing the research and completing Franklin's autobiography, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But here's the quote. A virtuous and industrious people may be cheaply governed. He was a disciple of Adam Smith and free trade, and was enamored with the laissez-faire policies of the physiocrats in France. He wrote admirably, laissez-faire, let us alone, and not to govern too strictly. He certainly was no Keynesian, although one may argue that he was more of a Chicago monetarist. He defended the rich and was worried about how incentives for the poor would affect them in a welfare program. He opposed the minimum wage law that was proposed at the time. He wrote in favor of free immigration, open borders, and fast population growth, which he tried to perpetuate himself. Single-handedly. He rejected any form of state religion or mandatory religious oaths of office, and he demanded that slavery be abolished in the new nation way before George Washington or Thomas Jefferson ever let their slaves go. And he learned by sad experience through his son and grandson that public service is less rewarding than private business. His foreign policy anticipated George Washington's farewell address by nearly 20 years. He wrote in 1778, quote, "The policy of America is to have commerce with all and war with none." So I see you're warming up to my presentation. Franklin was no free-thinking anarchist, sorry to say. In economics, he favored paper money and the real bills doctrine of expanding the money supply beyond specie, though no more than commerce requires. That's the real bills doctrine that we talk about in economics. Easy money, he said, would facilitate trade within reason. During the American Revolution, he justified runaway inflation. Now listen to this. You'll love this excuse for runaway inflation. It is an indirect way for all Americans to pay for the war. He really despised the tax evaders who refused to pay their fair share in this great cause of the American Revolution. Although he did beg Congress to improve the creditworthiness of the United States, after all, he was selling government loans, American loans, to the French at the time. He said, at least pay interest in hard currency, will you? Of course, they never did. However, he's a strong supporter of Hamiltonian central banking. Of course, he was an investor in the Bank of North American Stock, which was Robert Morris's bank, so he had a vested interest. And of course, his likeness on the $100 bill would please his vanity. Irredeemable American paper money. So, anyway, by the way, he's also in the 50-cent piece. Prior to the, in 1964, they changed it to Kennedy after the assassination of 65. But prior to that, for over a dozen years, the $half dollar had Benjamin Franklin's image on it. And so you have the paper $100 bill, and you have the 50-cent piece. And it's interesting that over the next 50-some years, 60-some years, the 50-cent piece is now worth about $12, and the $100 paper money is still only worth $100. So it could be that at some point they $50 will be worth more than the Franklin paper money. He argued that the state should be actively engaged in the free education of youth. So he was a big fan of democracy in that respect, and in dispelling ignorance of public fads and superstitions. Franklin was in league with Jefferson in emphasizing the themes of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as the goal of government, downplaying Locke's inalienable right of property, which is left out of the trilogy in the Declaration of Independence. There's a lot of reasons for that. But he said property is purely a creature of society. Thank you. And can be legitimately taxed to pay for civil society. He was quite critical of Americans unwilling to pay their fair share of society's dues. So among libertarians, the leading detractor is Murray Rothbard. So I want to talk a little bit about his attack on Franklin in his 4-volume history, Conceived in Liberty. Any of you read that, those 4 volumes? 1 volume's missing, by the way. Supposed to be the most controversial, but anyway, here's what Rothbard says about Franklin. The most overinflated leader of the entire colonial period in America. Rothbard deprecates Franklin's achievements and accentuates his peccadillos. The sly old Dr. Franklin is, quote, a sinister, subversive devil, an opportunist par excellence, cunning, fawning, meddling, opportunistic hedonist. I thought he was describing libertarians there. Franklin, according to Rothbard's version, was a warmonger, a Tory imperialist, and a speculator with his cronies who engaged in a pattern of plunder of the American taxpayer during the war. His Albany plan was more than an innocent way to unify the nation, but was a deliberate attempt to create a central super government. In his long history, Franklin comes off almost as badly as the deep-dyed conservative George Washington, who is characterized as a fumbling, inept general who sought to crush liberty and individualism among his soldiers and impose a statist army, losing one campaign after another. You guys read this book? It's pretty amazing revisionist history. Rothbard would have preferred the forgotten hero, the brilliant, gifted Charles Lee, as the American general champion of liberty and guerrilla warfare. And instead of Franklin as envoy to France, Rothbard chose the estimable, liberal, and Whigite Dr. Arthur Lee. Never mind that other historians uniformly describe Lee as bilious and cantankerous patriot who hated the French and accomplished little. In fact, Arthur Lee, as one of the commissioners, when Franklin went over to France to be the first ambassador, he was 70 years of age and they didn't trust him. So they sent over 5 other commissioners, including Arthur Lee and William Lee, and sent over John Adams at some point and so forth. You know how much money they raised? How much money did Arthur and his brother William raise? How much money did John Adams raise for the American cause in France? 0. Nothing. Franklin raised every single franc or livre, which was the currency at the time. Rothbard also likes Thomas Paine. Who doesn't? Author of the libertarian pamphlet Common Sense and promoter extraordinaire of the American cause. Interestingly, Rothbard ignores the fact that Paine's mentor was none other than Benjamin Franklin, and that Franklin was a lifelong supporter of Paine's ideas, even when they were radical. What did Paine see that Rothbard couldn't? Rothbard never explains the fact that somehow, by July 1776, the Tory imperialist Franklin suddenly became the radical revolutionary Franklin, along with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Franklin was indeed one of the first founders to call for independence. In 1775, he called for the drafting of all ties, to dissolve all ties of allegiance. And he said this: "It has always been my opinion that it is the natural right of men to quit, when they please, the society or state and the country in which they are born, and either join with another or form a new one as they think proper." Furthermore, Franklin, like Rothbard, appeared to be an advocate of natural rights. Quote, "I am a mortal enemy to arbitrary government and unlimited power. I am naturally very jealous for the rights and liberties of my country, and the least encroachment of those invaluable privileges is apt to make my blood boil." Now, no libertarian could have said that better. Franklin is given no credit for the radical and libertarian Pennsylvania Constitution, written in 1776 and endorsed by Franklin throughout his lifetime. And what about Franklin's critical role in raising military and financial aid in France? He was given little credit other than the following sentence from Rothbard's poison pen. Quote, "The wily old tactician Franklin proved to be a master at the intricacies of lying, bamboozling, and intriguing, that form of warp and woof of diplomacy. Moreover, the old rogue was a huge hit with the French, who saw him as the embodiment of reason, the natural man, and bon ami." Unquote. Not surprisingly, Rothbard is deadly silent about Franklin's thrill of victory and Arthur Lee's agony of defeat when it came to fundraising for the American cause. Rothbard also ignores Franklin's libertarian views regarding military service. This is one of the more interesting aspects of Franklin. I don't think Rothbard knew about this. If he had, he might have changed his views. So Franklin preferred a private militia over a publicly financed army. According to the historian Lorraine Smith Pangle, who wrote a wonderful book called The Political Philosophy of Benjamin Franklin, says, although he willingly did his part as a common soldier, listen to this, he had no taste for a good fight, no love of danger, no attraction to the glories of heroic self-overcoming. So much did he hate tyranny and love liberty, reason, and gentle persuasion that he could not see the need for military discipline. Now, in today's world where we honor our soldiers who come back from Iraq and our veterans and so forth, and they get the first ones to be on the plane, and we have all of these documentaries about soldiers and so forth. This part about Franklin is pretty interesting. In fact, he said captains general should be elected by their peers, not appointed. Very interesting. His whole thing about military. Believe me, George Washington would have fired Ben Franklin like that if he had been there, because Washington was really a difficult person in that regard. I see I've offended people already. Finally, Rothbard fails to quote Franklin's negative views on war in general. Listen to this. When will men be convinced that even successful wars do at length become misfortunes to those who unjustly commerce them, and who triumph blindly in their success, not seeing all its consequences? There is so little good gained, and so much mischief done generally by wars, that I wish the imprudence of undertaking them was more evident to princes. For in my opinion, there never was a good war or a bad peace. What vast additions to the conveniences and comforts of living might mankind have acquired if the money spent in wars had been employed in works of public utility? So he goes on and on here about this. To show how difficult this view is, I could talk a lot about different aspects, and in the Q&A I'd be glad to talk about Franklin's views on religion, his views on women, and so forth. But let's just talk a little bit about some of the economics in Franklin. In many ways, Franklin was America's first champion of free enterprise. And Austrian economists would be pleased with his emphasis on entrepreneurship, industry, and thrift. Eugen von Bavarick and Max Weber recognized his genius, and so did American capitalists Andrew Carnegie and Thomas Mellon, who were deeply influenced by his autobiography. In fact, just by show of hands, how many have read the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin? That's generally the case whenever I speak at groups on this. 5 to 10%. If you lived in the 20s, if you went to school in the 20s, every hand would go up. Every hand. The level of education is just another example of the decline in education, in my opinion, that people don't read the most famous autobiography that's ever been written after St. Augustine's Confessions. There's over a dozen various editions of the autobiography. You can get them in any Barnes & Noble bookstore. I brought copies of the original autobiography with me today. I have about a dozen copies, as well as the completed autobiography, which I did a couple of years ago. So, he was an incurable optimist, like most Americans. Franklin was always bullish on America. And at the end of the War of Independence, he predicted with accuracy, America is, with God's blessing, will become a great and happy country. Franklin was sympathetic with laissez-faire economics of the day. He was a free trader who wrote famously, "No nation was ever ruined by trade." And the other thing that was interesting about Franklin is he was a defender of commercial society. And for generations, for millennium, there was this negative view about merchants, about bankers, about speculators, and so forth, that even carried on to the day where people like Thomas Jefferson and others looked very dimly down on bankers and the commercial society that enveloped. Franklin was one of the most important advancers or defenders of commercial society. He defended merchants. He defended speculators. He defended the banking community and so forth as an extremely important part of society, of commercial society. And he was a big fan of big cities. You see, Franklin did not agree with Jefferson, who advocated the agrarian society, that the farmer was the ideal, which came out of Aristotle and the Greeks and the Romans. Franklin was very much a modern person. Of all the founders, he is the most modern of them all in terms of his defending the rights of individuals, of races, of minorities, very much in defense of women's rights, of blacks being equal to whites. This was a minority view at that time. It was one that Franklin shared. He describes, and I describe it, he writes about it in a completed autobiography where he visited the Negro School of Philadelphia, which he helped found. And he went there and visited one day, and he said, "I was very much surprised to learn that the black students were just as bright as the white students." So, very controversial person at that time, and the first president of the Society to Abolish Slavery in Philadelphia. However, Frank, hold your applause because there's some parts you may not agree with. He was no social libertarian, despite the fact that he was famous for reading books in his room in the nude. He frequented the salacious Hellfire Club in London, where women of the evening dressed up as nuns. He flirted with the French ladies in Paris. I have a wonderful chapter in the book called The Ambassador's Life in France, which I think you'll really enjoy, about his tete-a-tetes with Madame Brionne and other wonderful ladies of this, at the time who were brilliant, intelligent women who, Franklin, they got along really well. This Adams, John and Abigail Adams thought very differently, but Franklin loved the French ladies. But anyway, here's an interesting thing. Franklin wrote stern letters to his daughter Sally, chastising her for wanting to wear the latest fashions while a war was going on, and refused to buy his grandson Benny a gold watch while in France. He dressed plainly and constantly preached economy. He promoted at all times frugality and industry in both public and private life. And when he returned, after being in London for a number of years, returned to Philadelphia and attacked the growth of taverns in Philadelphia in 1762. He hated mobs of all kinds, and though a defender of free speech, railed against scurrilous newspaper reports. And he was no friend of John Wilkes, who is a famous character in British society, the defender of free speech, who was imprisoned for libeling the King of England. But Franklin criticized the drunken, mad mobs that supported Wilkes and liberty. So he was a social conservative in many ways, later on in his older life, as many of us are as we get older. So I mentioned that he was a firm believer in democracy. He didn't really like the centralized executive. In fact, he proposed initially that instead of one president, there should be 12 executives. 12 executives running the government. So you can see he was not into central authority in that respect. He was opposed to public offices of profit. And here's a great quote from the historian Bernard Fay. He concludes, Congress was directly opposed to Franklin's philosophical tendency, which might be summed up in this formula. See if you recognize this formula. The least government possible is the greatest possible good. Boy, now that's a libertarian statement. You're not applauding for that one. I don't even know why you're here. All right. So the other thing really good about Franklin, he was a strong believer in voluntary associations. Franklin was ahead of his time in financing good causes with his business profits. He was civil-minded earlier in his career, helping to finance the first fire company, the nation's oldest property insurance company, Philadelphia's first hospital, library, militia, all mostly with private funds. Now, I will tell you, he's famous for a lot of inventions, as you know. He's famous for the Franklin stove, for the lightning rod, for the bifocals. There's lots of things he's famous for. But did you know he invented the fundraising technique of matching funds? So we have him to blame for that. So those guys who get up and say, I'll match whatever you give us $100, I'll give you $100, and that sort of thing. He did that with the first Philadelphia hospital. He went to the government initially and he said, look, would you be willing to, we really need a hospital to help particularly the indigent and the poor. They just have nowhere to go. And the Pennsylvania Assembly said, no, that's not a proper use of government. We're not going to do that at all. And he said, okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. If I can raise an equal amount of 2,000 pounds from the private sector, will you match it? And they said, yeah, go right ahead. There's no way you're going to raise 2,000 pounds. Well, that was a big mistake because Franklin was the fundraiser extraordinaire. There's never been anyone as good as he is. And he raised the 2,000 pounds, and so the government went and matched it. So that was the creation of the first private hospital. But Franklin was a tireless supporter of volunteer organizations and philanthropic projects. So the NGOs, non-government agencies, it was his style. Rather than depending on the government and the great lords as they did in Europe and France and so forth, Americans offered a better way. And de Tocqueville talks about this. Volunteer collective action and self-help individualism was very much the vogue for Franklin. He didn't care much for the poor laws and other forms of public charity. but was a strong supporter of private charities and good causes. So you have some wonderful stories in the autobiography, in the completed autobiography, where he wasn't particularly much of a churchgoer, but when he did attend church, and Reverend Whitfield is famous for having an ability to convince people to give money to good causes. And Whitefield had, he wanted to start an orphanage in Georgia. And Franklin was very much opposed to this. He said, no, 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 if we're going to have an orphanage, let's have it in Philadelphia. Why should we have it in Georgia? But Whitefield said, no, 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 we've got to have it in Georgia. And so Franklin came and attended a church service where Reverend Whitefield was trying to raise money for his Georgia program. And so Franklin says, as I entered and sat down at the pew, I was determined not to give him a single penny. But he said after 10 minutes of his oratory, I was finally convinced, oh, okay, I'll reach in, I'll give him some of my coppers. And then another 10 minutes in his oratory, and he says, wow, this guy's so convincing, I guess I better give him my silver. And by time he was through with the oration, Franklin had reached into his pocket, even taken out his gold coins. He gave him everything. So really an incredible ability to be suckered into. All right, so anyway, the City Watch Fire Company, Pennsylvania Academy, which became the University of Pennsylvania, the Negro School of Philadelphia. He gave money to all of the churches, the Jewish places, all of the religious organizations, but always did it anonymously so he didn't offend anybody. He wrote of these private initiatives, I have always thought that one man of tolerable abilities might work great changes and accomplish great affairs of mankind. And in another part of the book, in the completed autobiography, and when I give it to people, I always refer to him to page 283, and it's a great little quote. He says, it's incredible the quantity of good that a single person can do if he makes a business out of it. So, early in his career, he encouraged his son, William, to become a public servant, and he was appointed the royal governor of New Jersey. He ended up destroying his friendship, because what happened during the war was his son, William, turned against him and decided to remain a loyalist during the war. So I'm just going to read you one little part here from the completed autobiography. The completed biography, by the way, is all in Franklin's own words, so it's not mine. My wife and I edited it. We went through 50 volumes of the papers of Benjamin Franklin, which are being compiled at Yale University. And we culled through there and came up with the rest of his story. Franklin's original autobiography here ends in 1757, when he was age 53. And so there's nothing in the original autobiography about the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, his ambassador to France, the creation of a new constitution and a new nation. None of that's in here. And so it's very disappointing when you read the autobiography. It's a great book about a man who goes from rags to riches and how he becomes a super success and then makes his scientific contributions and his civic contributions and so forth. Definitely worth reading. But there's nothing about the political Franklin like there is in the completed autobiography that my wife were able to do and put this through, and it's just been turned out to be a wonderful experience of completing his autobiography. So anyway, let me just read to you a little quote here that I think will give you a sense of how Franklin felt about getting his son involved by making him the royal governor of New Jersey. Nothing has ever hurt me so much and affected me with such keen sensations as to find myself deserted in my old age by my only son, William. And not only deserted, but to find him taking up arms against me in a cause where my good fame, fortune, and life were all at stake. William conceived, he said, that his duty was to his king, and regard for his country required this. I ought not to blame him for differing in sentiments with me in public affairs. We are men all subject to errors. Our opinions are not in our power. They are formed and governed much by circumstances that are inexplicable. His situation was such that few could censure his remaining neutrality, though there are natural family duties which precede political ones and cannot be extinguished by them. This is a disagreeable subject. I drop it.
Wow.
So I think you can sense a little bit of the power that's there in Franklin. So what I'd like to do is do a little conclusion here, and then we can open up to questions, arguments, and so forth regarding Dr. Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, in conclusion, had his share of foibles, but in many ways he was ahead of his time. How do we balance his magnificent achievements with his flaws? Well, before you make up your mind, I recommend that you study the man himself. One of the reasons my wife and I completed and edited the completed autobiography of Benjamin Franklin was so that you could read Franklin's own words. You know, there's been lots of biographies written about Franklin. There's probably, you can go in any bookstore and you'll see 3 or 4 biographies written about Franklin. They all have their prejudices. And I read through these things and they say, well, yeah, he's very critical of his attitude, the way he treated his wife, Deborah. He basically abandoned Deborah as he went over to London as the London agent, and then she died while he was in London. He didn't come back to see her for many years. He basically abandoned her. And then when you read Franklin's own writings, where on numerous occasions he begged his wife to come over from Pennsylvania to London, she simply had one of these phobias, aversions to being on the high seas. Kind of like some people don't like to get in airplanes for whatever reason. So they drifted apart. It wasn't like it was some kind of malicious abandonment. But you get that sense in reading the completed autobiography. I'll give you one other example of Franklin's prowess. And this is when he was over as ambassador to France. And he'd been there for 4 or 5 years, and he had raised all this money to fight the war, basically to finance arms, to get loans from the French. And he was able to raise millions of livres, while the other commissioners were unfriendly to the French. Franklin was the only one who got along with the French, and they just adored the man. So Congress was absolutely determined to get more money, to get as much money they could from France in terms of loans and gifts and that sort of thing. And Franklin was their man. They didn't have anyone else. So they write this letter to Franklin and say, well, you know, you've raised a lot of money, but we need 25,000 livres in addition to all the money you've raised. And Franklin writes back and says, are you kidding me? I have reached the limit of my ability to raise money. The French just don't have that ability. You can't ask me. Please don't ask me to raise more money. And they came back and they said, no, we're desperate. We're out of money. We need help from the French, or our cause is lost. So Franklin reluctantly wrote in his finest diplomatic pen a letter to the King of France and to Vergennes, the French foreign minister Vergennes, and begged him for this money. And basically said, listen, if you don't give us this money, you're going to lose the war, we're going to lose the war, and the British will now dominate France and America and the rest of the Western world for the next 200 years. Is that what you want? We beg of you, we need you to borrow money. So he sends off this wonderful letter in his best diplomatic pen. Here's absolutely nothing. A week goes by, no response. 2 weeks goes by, no response. So Franklin writes another letter. Did you get my letter? Please, can you give me a response? And finally Vergennes says, come to Versailles and we will discuss it. So he quickly gets in his carriage. He goes to Versailles, which is an hour outside of Paris. And he's ushered in to Vergennes' office, and Vergennes is there to greet him. No smile, has a very depressed look on his face, shaking his head. And he says, "Dr. Franklin, we know that you're broke. We know that all the money we loaned you, you're never going to be able to repay. And not only that, Dr. Franklin, but we're broke. We don't have any money in the treasury at all. So I'm sorry, Dr. Franklin. We cannot loan you 25,000 livres. We can't loan you anything. I'm sorry." And then he paused. And then he said, "But because of your love of the French people, and because of the love the King of France has for you, he is going to give you out of his own pocket 6 million livres." Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's what we call fundraising. So Jeff has his work cut out for him tonight, I'm sure. But maybe Ben Franklin can help. Who knows? Anyway, I thank you very much. I do want to mention one thing. I brought some copies of the original autobiography. It's volume 1, and it's a very special edition that Regnery published, and then the completed autobiography. And for those of you who do purchase it, I have a rare Franklin stamp that I put in each edition with the inscription. And one of them includes the only stamp that was made on the 100th anniversary of the post office, 1947. It's the only stamp of George Washington, the father of our country, and Benjamin Franklin, the grandfather of our country, together on one stamp. So if you buy the book, you'll get a copy of the rare stamp as well. So I'll be here afterwards. But I'd like to open it up for questions.